On the morning of September 19th, 1944, in a shallow valley outside a French village called Arracourt, a column of German Panther tanks rolled forward into thick fog, confident they were about to slaughter a handful of lightly armored American scout vehicles. Within minutes, 4 of those Panthers were burning. The tank that killed them wasn't heavier, it wasn't better armored. It couldn't even punch through the front of the tank it was fighting. It was a paper-thin American tank destroyer called the M18 Hellcat. And the trick that let it win took less time than it takes to read this sentence. This is the story of how the U.S. Army built a tank that was designed to lose a fair fight, and then made sure the fight was never fair. To understand why the Hellcat had to cheat, you first have to understand what it was up against. By the autumn of 1944, the Panther was arguably the finest medium tank fielded by any army in the war. It carried the 7.5-centimeter KWK 42L/70, a gun so long and so fast that its shells left the barrel at over 900 meters per second. At combat ranges, that gun could punch through more than 140 millimeters of steel, enough to kill almost anything the Allies put in front of it, including most Shermans, at distances where the Sherman's own gun could do nothing back. The Panther's frontal glacis plate was sloped at 55 degrees, turning 80 millimeters of actual steel into the equivalent of nearly 140 millimeters when struck head-on. Engineers on both sides understood the mathematics of sloped armor. A shell hitting angled steel has to travel through far more material than one hitting a flat plate of the same thickness, and it is far more likely to deflect entirely. The Panther was, in essence, a moving geometry problem that killed anyone who solved it incorrectly. Now look at the machine sent to stop it. The M18 gun motor carriage, nicknamed the Hellcat, weighed under 18 tons, barely a third of the Panther's weight. Its armor topped out at 1 inch, about 25 millimeters, thin enough that a heavy machine gun could threaten it, and any Panther round, no matter where it landed, would go straight through. The Hellcat's turret had no roof. Rain fell on the crew. Shrapnel fell on the crew. There was, by any conventional standard of 1944 tank design, no reason this vehicle should have been allowed anywhere near a Panther. And yet the U.S. Army built nearly 2,500 of them, sent them to the front, and watched them rack up one of the best kill ratios of any Allied armored vehicle in the entire war. The paradox is the whole story. To understand it, you need to understand why the Army built a tank this fragile on purpose. The Hellcat wasn't a mistake. It was a philosophy made of steel, or rather, a philosophy made of the absence of steel. Before the war, U.S. Army doctrine had split armored warfare into 2 separate jobs. Tanks existed to support infantry, break through defensive lines, and exploit breakthroughs in open country. They were not, in the official doctrine of the era, supposed to be the primary tool for killing other tanks. That job belonged to a separate branch entirely, the Tank Destroyer Force, formed in 1941 under the banner Seek, Strike, Destroy. The idea, borrowed partly from lessons the French and British had already paid for in blood, was that the correct answer to a mass of enemy armor was not a wall of equally heavy friendly armor, but a mobile reserve of specialized hunters. Vehicles built around one gun, minimal armor, and enough speed to get to a threatened sector before the enemy could exploit it, deliver a killing blow, and then vanish before the enemy could organize a response. The Hellcat did not appear out of nowhere. It was the 3rd generation of a lineage that began with an armored car concept in 1941, evolved through the M10 tank destroyer, itself a Sherman hull with thinner armor and an open turret bolted on, and finally arrived, after 2 years of prototypes designated T-70 and T-67, at a purpose-built chassis that owed nothing to the Sherman at all. Engineers stripped every unnecessary pound from the hull, dropped in the lightest reliable engine they could find, and built the whole vehicle around a single premise. This machine would never need to survive a hit, only to avoid one. That premise sounds almost suicidal until you remember it was never meant to operate alone or hold ground. It was meant to arrive, kill, and leave, which is precisely why the Army classified it not as a tank at all, but as a gun motor carriage, a distinction that mattered enormously to the officers who wrote its doctrine, even if it meant nothing to the German crews staring down its muzzle. This is the doctrine that produced the Hellcat's entire design brief. Every gram of steel not spent on armor was spent on speed and gun performance instead. The result, powered by a 350 horsepower Continental radial engine driving an innovative automatic torque-matic transmission, was a vehicle that could hit 55 miles per hour on a road, nearly twice the top speed of a Sherman, and the fastest tracked fighting vehicle of the entire war on either side. Compare that to the Panther's roughly 30 miles per hour on a good road, and slower still across broken ground, where its heavier weight punished the suspension and burned through fuel it often didn't have enough of. On paper, the M18 could outrun the Panther. In practice, that speed advantage was the entire weapon. Here's where the trick begins, and here's why it worked in seconds rather than minutes. A tank turret does not rotate instantly. The Panther's turret traverse, especially the hydraulic system that powered it, took a meaningful number of seconds to swing through a wide arc. And under stress, with a commander shouting target corrections through a hatch, that traverse time stretched even longer. A Hellcat that appeared on a Panther's flank at speed presented its crew with a brutal arithmetic problem. By the time the German gunner had cranked the turret around to bear on the threat, the American vehicle might already be somewhere else entirely, or might already have fired. The tactic American tank destroyer crews developed, refined through hard lessons in Italy and Normandy, was blunt and unglamorous. Never fight a Panther where its gun already points. Use speed to reach an angle the Panther's turret cannot cover fast enough. Put a 76mm high-velocity round through the thinner side or rear plate, armor that, unlike the glacis, offered nowhere near the protection of the frontal slope, and then use that same speed to get out of the reply's way. The entire engagement, from first sighting a flank to a Panther burning, could take less time than it takes to boil water. That is, the seconds in the title. And it was not an exaggeration crews invented for war stories. It was a documented, repeatable tactic, and it is the reason a 76mm gun that could barely scratch the front of a Panther became, in the right position, a weapon capable of killing it outright. The 76mm M1A1 gun itself deserves its own moment of attention, because the myth of the underpowered Hellcat gun obscures a more interesting truth. Against a Panther's frontal glacis, the standard American round was indeed marginal. Penetration only became reliable at ranges so close that most crews considered it a last resort. But against the sides, the rear deck, and especially the turret ring and lower hull, the picture flipped completely. Those surfaces on a Panther carried nowhere near the effective thickness of the front plate, some barely 40 to 45 millimeters, well within range of what the Hellcat's gun could defeat at combat distances of a few hundred meters. The tank destroyer crews were not fighting a losing battle against superior armor. They were fighting a geometry battle, and the trick was simply making sure the geometry always favored them before the trigger was ever pulled. Nowhere did this doctrine prove itself more completely than at Arracourt. In mid-September 1944, elements of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, reinforced by the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and its 3 companies of 36 Hellcats, were holding ground near the Moselle River when 2 fresh German Panzer brigades, equipped heavily with new production Panthers, were thrown into a counterattack meant to blunt the American advance into Lorraine. The Germans expected to crush a thin covering force. Instead, they drove straight into a killing ground shrouded in fog that, ironically, worked against the side with the longer-ranged gun. In that fog, the Panther's advantage at distance evaporated. Engagements collapsed to a few hundred meters, exactly the range band where the Hellcat's flanking trick worked best, and the German gun's long-range dominance meant nothing. Sergeant Henry Hartman's Hellcat crew alone accounted for 6 kills that day, most of them Panthers, darting from firing position to firing position faster than the German formation could reorient. In one engagement, American gunners hit tanks from a flanking angle, then physically hid the vehicle behind a reverse slope of a hill, denying the Germans any way to trace the shots back to their source. The confused Panther crews, unable to identify where the fire was coming from in the mist, sat exposed while a second wave of American armor finished the job from a completely different direction. By the time the 3-day battle ended, the 704th and supporting units had destroyed roughly 40 German tanks, the overwhelming majority of them Panthers or Panzer IVs, for the loss of a handful of Hellcats. It remains one of the most lopsided tank engagements of the entire European campaign, and it happened because a fast, fragile, undergunned American vehicle refused to fight the battle the Panther was built to win. It is worth pausing on the numbers because they invite an obvious question. How does a tank destroyer with barely enough armor to stop a rifle round outkill a heavy tank brigade nearly 3 times over? Part of the answer is the fog itself, which erased the Panther's single greatest advantage: the ability to open fire from 1,500 meters or more, well outside the effective range of the American gun, and kill Shermans and Hellcats before they even knew where the shot came from. Strip that range advantage away, force the fight down to a few hundred meters in zero visibility, and the equation inverts completely. A gun that struggles at 1,500 meters is entirely lethal at 300. And a crew trained to read terrain and move fast can find that 300-meter flanking shot in conditions where a slower, heavier vehicle simply cannot reposition in time. Arracourt was not luck. It was the exact scenario American tank destroyer doctrine had been built, on paper, to create. And then it actually happened, in the mud, exactly as the manuals predict. The trick did not stay confined to one battle in Lorraine. 3 months later, during the German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hellcat battalions were rushed piecemeal into the path of the same Panther brigades, this time in the narrow, snow-choked roads of the Ardennes rather than open farmland. The terrain should have favored the Germans. Dense forest and tight village streets limit exactly the kind of wide flanking run that made Arracourt possible. And indeed, in several early engagements, Panthers that anticipated the trick and kept their flanks covered against tree lines exacted a heavy toll on American armor caught in the open. But wherever a Hellcat crew found even a narrow lane to a side street, a reverse slope firing position, or a moment when a German column strung itself out along a single road, the same tactic reasserted itself. Get an angle the enemy turret cannot cover in time, fire, and displace before the reply arrives. German after-action reports from the Ardennes catalog a startling number of Panthers lost not to enemy fire at all, but to breakdowns, frozen fuel lines, and vehicles simply abandoned when they ran dry. A reminder that the Hellcat's speed was fighting an enemy that was, by December 1944, already losing a second, quieter war against its own logistics. There is also a myth worth correcting here because war stories tend to simplify. Not every Panther kill claimed by a Hellcat crew was actually a Panther. Under fire and smoke, mud, and failing light, American gunners frequently misidentified Panzer IVs, Stug 3 assault guns, and even the occasional captured vehicle as Panthers. And post-war analysis of German loss records has trimmed some of the more heroic individual tallies. That correction does not diminish the story. If anything, it sharpens it. Even accounting for overclaiming, German unit records confirm the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and its sister units genuinely gutted 2 full Panzer brigades at Arracourt in 3 days, a documented material loss the German army could not replace as easily as the crews who died pulling the trigger. But this story would be dishonest if it ended there as a simple triumph, because the trick had a brutal cost, and the men who executed it paid it constantly. That open turret, the same one that gave Hellcat crews the wide, unobstructed field of view they needed to spot a flanking route before the enemy did, also left them naked to artillery airbursts, mortar fragments, and small arms fire raining straight down into the fighting compartment. The vehicle commander, who often had to stand exposed above the turret ring to operate the ring-mounted .50 caliber machine gun, took disproportionate casualties throughout the war, a grim, largely unspoken price for the very visibility advantage that made the flanking trick possible in the first place. And the trick itself was unforgiving of mistakes. It demanded a crew read the terrain instantly, judge the enemy turret's likely traverse speed correctly, and commit to a firing position without hesitation, because a Hellcat caught stationary in a Panther's open arc of fire had no armor at all to save it. Crews who got the geometry wrong did not get a second attempt. The same speed that made the Hellcat deadly when used correctly made it a death trap the moment a crew tried to slug it out head-on. And after Arracourt, some Hellcat units learned that lesson the hard way against Panthers that anticipated the flank and pre-positioned to cover it. The men who executed this trick were, for the most part, remarkably young and remarkably unglamorous. Sergeant Hartman, credited with 6 kills in a single day at Arracourt, was a National Guardsman from a battalion that had only recently converted from towed anti-tank guns to the Hellcat itself. Men who had spent most of the war dug in behind a static cannon suddenly handed one of the fastest vehicles in the theater and told to hunt with it instead. Crews across the Tank Destroyer battalions described the shift in almost identical terms. Survival now depended less on the thickness of the plate around them and more on how quickly a gunner could read a slope, how confidently a driver could commit to a firing lane, and how disciplined a crew could be about disengaging the instant the shot was fired, win or lose. It was a style of fighting that rewarded aggression and precision over endurance, and it produced a strange kind of soldier, men who had to be simultaneously more reckless and more disciplined than a Sherman crew, because the Hellcat offered no second chances if the geometry ever turned against them. The vehicle outlived the doctrine that built it. By the time Korea broke out 5 years later, heavier post-war tank designs and improved anti-tank guided weapons had made the thin and fast tank destroyer concept obsolete, and the Hellcat's brief but violent career effectively ended with the surrender of Germany in 1945. But its influence did not. The core insight, that mobility and positioning could substitute for armor, that a weaker gun in the right place beats a stronger gun in the wrong one, became a permanent thread in armored warfare thinking, echoed decades later in everything from Cold War tank destroyer doctrine to the anti-armor ambush tactics taught to light infantry using shoulder-fired weapons against main battle tanks. The specific machine faded from service quickly. The specific idea never really left. There is a deeper irony buried in this machine, and it is worth sitting with. The United States, the industrial giant of the war, the nation that could outproduce every rival combined, chose in this one case not to build a bigger, heavier answer to the Panther. It built the opposite, something smaller, thinner, and faster, and then trained men to win with cunning rather than steel. Meanwhile, Germany, chronically short on fuel, rubber, and skilled crews by late 1944, kept building ever heavier, ever more mechanically fragile tanks that broke down as often as they were destroyed in combat. During the Ardennes offensive that winter, German after-action reports would note nearly as many Panthers lost to breakdowns and lack of fuel as to enemy fire. The side with fewer resources tried to win through mass and armor. The side with more resources won, in this particular matchup, through speed and precision. It is the exact inversion of what most people assume about how America fought the war, and it is why the Hellcat remains one of the most quietly remarkable weapons of the conflict. Not because it was powerful, but because it was honest about its own weakness and built an entire tactical doctrine to exploit someone else's. By the time production ended in October 1944, 2,507 Hellcats had rolled off the line, and by the war's end, the type had compiled one of the best tank versus tank kill ratios of any American armored vehicle. A startling statistic for something that, on a spec sheet, looks hopelessly outclassed by nearly everything it fought. The lesson the Hellcat teaches is not really about a machine at all. It is about what happens when you stop trying to win the fight your enemy designed and instead force him into a fight he never trained for. The Panther was engineered to dominate a straight, frontal duel. The Hellcat was built, and its crews were trained to make sure that duel never happened, to turn every engagement into a race to the flank instead, a race the Panther, weighed down by 45 tons of the very armor that made it so feared head-on, could never win. In the fog outside Arracourt, and in dozens of smaller, less remembered engagements across France and Germany through the winter of 1944 and into 1945, that single tactical insight, speed as armor, position as protection, seconds as the entire margin between a kill and a burning wreck, turned an outgunned, underprotected American tank destroyer into one of the deadliest Panther killers of the Second World War. The trick was never really about the machine. It was about refusing to fight fair and doing it faster than the enemy could ever react.